My entitled brother wants the family house for free and expects me to pay for it. Hey Reddit, I've been a long-time lurker, but today I feel like I need to share my story. It's a long one, so bear with me. I'm in my early 40s, and I've worked hard to build a stable life for myself. But no matter how much you achieve, sometimes family can find a way to drag you down. This story revolves around my younger brother, Kevin. He's the baby of the family, always doted on by our parents, and never really had to grow up. Meanwhile, I've been the responsible one, the one who worked, saved, and made sure everything was in order. But Kevin's entitlement has finally reached a boiling point, and I'm at my wit's end. Growing up, it was clear that Kevin was the favorite. He was the youngest, and my parents treated him like he could do no wrong. If he got into trouble, it was always someone else's fault. If he wanted something, he got it. Meanwhile, I was expected to be the mature one, the one who set an example. I wasn't resentful at first. I actually liked being the responsible one. I got good grades, worked part-time jobs in high school, and saved for college. I knew that if I wanted to get anywhere in life, I had to work for it. My parents were supportive, but they always assumed that I didn't need much help since I was so capable. Kevin, on the other hand, was always treated with kid gloves. As we got older, the differences in how we were treated became even more apparent. While I was focused on building a career, Kevin was coasting. He dropped out of college after a year, claiming it wasn't for him, and bounced from one job to another without ever sticking to anything. But instead of encouraging him to take responsibility for his life, my parents coddled him, always making excuses for his lack of direction. Our family house was a modest but charming home in a suburban neighborhood. It wasn't anything fancy, but it was full of memories, holidays, birthdays, and family gatherings. My parents bought it shortly after they got married, and it was the only home Kevin and I had ever known. As our parents got older, the house became harder for them to maintain. They both had health issues, and I could see that taking care of the place was becoming too much for them. I suggested they downsize to something smaller, maybe a condo, where they wouldn't have to worry about yard work or repairs. But they were resistant to the idea, saying they wanted to keep the house and the family. Kevin, who was still living at home well into his 30s, had a different idea. He was adamant that he should inherit the house. He argued that since he was the one living there and taking care of our parents, which was a generous interpretation of the truth, it made sense for him to get the house when they passed. I was taken aback by this. It wasn't that I wanted the house. I had my own home and was happy where I was. But the way Kevin was so casually staking a claim on the house, as if it was his birthright, rubbed me the wrong way. Our parents, predictably, didn't push back against the suggestion. In fact, they seemed to think it made sense. I didn't say anything at the time, but I started to get worried about what would happen when the time came to deal with the house. Kevin was notoriously bad with money, and I had a sinking feeling that he was banking on the house as his ticket to an easy life. Things came to a head earlier this year when our parents decided to finally update their will. They called me over to discuss their plans, and that's when Kevin dropped the bombshell. "I've been thinking," he said, as if he hadn't been planning this for years. "It makes sense for me to get the house. I mean, I'm the one living here, and I'll make sure it stays in the family." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Kevin had no job, no prospects, and no ability to take care of the house financially. He was living there rent-free, contributing nothing, and now he wanted to be handed the house on a silver platter? "Kevin," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "how exactly do you plan to maintain the house? You don't have a job, and property taxes alone are going to be expensive." He waved his hand dismissively. "I'll figure it out. Besides, you can help me out with that." I stared at him in disbelief. "Help you out? Kevin, I have my own mortgage to pay my own bills. I can't afford to support two households." This is when Kevin's entitlement truly came to light. He shrugged and said, "You're doing well for yourself. It wouldn't be that big of a deal for you to cover the taxes and some of the upkeep. After all, I'll be the one living here, taking care of the place." I looked at my parents, expecting them to intervene, but they just sat there, looking uncomfortable. It was clear they didn't want to upset Kevin, and they certainly weren't going to take my side. I left that meeting feeling a mix of anger and disbelief. How had things gotten to this point? Why did Kevin feel so entitled to something he hadn't earned? And why were my parents enabling him? After that meeting, my relationship with Kevin became strained. I could tell he was annoyed with me for not immediately agreeing to his plan, and our interactions grew tense. He started making passive-aggressive comments about how some people only cared about money and how I was trying to push him out of the family home. It was exhausting. I had always tried to be a good brother to Kevin, to support him despite his shortcomings, but this was too much. The entitlement, the lack of responsibility. It was like he was living in a different reality where everything was handed to him and he didn't have to work for anything. My parents, meanwhile, continued to coddle him. Whenever I brought up my concerns, they brushed them off, saying that Kevin was just going through a tough time and that he'd figure things out eventually. But I knew better. Kevin wasn't going to figure things out. He was going to continue living off my parents until they were gone, and then he'd expect me to pick up the pieces. The more I thought about it, the more frustrated I became. I had worked hard to build a life for myself, and I wasn't about to let my brother drag me down because he refused to grow up. Things came to a head a few weeks later. My parents called me over for another family meeting, and I knew it wasn't going to be good. Sure enough, as soon as I walked in the door, I could tell that Kevin had been working on them. "We've been talking," my dad said, looking uncomfortable, "and we think it might be best if Kevin takes over the house. He'll need some help with the expenses, of course, but we know you're in a position to assist him." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It was one thing for Kevin to ask for the house, but now my parents were essentially telling me that I was responsible for financially supporting him? No, I said firmly. I'm not paying for the house. I'm not paying Kevin's bills. If he wants the house, he needs to figure out how to afford it on his own. My parents looked shocked, and Kevin's face turned red with anger. So that's it, he snapped. You're just gonna let me fail? Let the family house go to strangers? I'm not letting anything happen, I replied. I'm telling you that you need to take responsibility for your life. If you want the house, you need to get a job, save money, and figure out how to afford it. I'm not your safety net. Kevin stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. My parents tried to reason with me, saying that Kevin just needed a little help, that he'd figure things out eventually, but I stood my ground. I told them that I wasn't going to enable his behavior anymore, and that they needed to stop coddling him. It was one of the hardest conversations I've ever had. My parents were hurt, Kevin was furious, and I felt like the bad guy. But I knew I had made the right decision. I wasn't going to let my brother drag me down because he refused to grow up. After that confrontation, things got even more strained. Kevin stopped talking to me altogether, and my parents were distant. I could tell they were disappointed in me, but I also knew they were starting to see the truth. That Kevin wasn't going to change unless he was forced to. A few weeks passed, and then something unexpected happened. Kevin got a job. It wasn't a great job, just a part-time gig at a retail store, but it was something. I was surprised, to say the least. For the first time in years, it seemed like Kevin was actually trying to take some responsibility. But then the other shoe dropped. Kevin called me one night, and I could tell he was trying to play nice. He apologized for the way things had gone down and said he wanted to make things right. I was cautious, but I agreed to meet up with him to talk. When we met, Kevin seemed sincere. He admitted that he hadn't been responsible and that he needed to do better. He even said he was willing to get a second job to help cover the cost of the house. For a moment, I actually thought things might be turning around. But then he dropped the bombshell. I've been thinking, he said, shifting uncomfortably. Maybe we could work something out. Like, I could live in a house, and you could just cover the mortgage for a few years until I get on my feet. It wouldn't be forever, just until I'm stable. I felt like I had been punched in the gut. After everything, Kevin still expected me to bail him out. He still didn't get it. No, Kevin, I said, my voice trembling with frustration. I'm not paying your mortgage. I'm not covering your bills. You need to take responsibility for your life. If you want the house, you need to pay for it. End of story. Kevin didn't take it well. He accused me of being selfish, of not caring about family, of abandoning him when he needed me most. It was the same manipulative tactics he'd always used, and I wasn't falling for it. I walked away from that conversation, feeling a mix of anger and sadness. I had hoped that maybe, just maybe, Kevin was ready to change. But it was clear that he was still stuck in the same entitled mindset. After that last conversation, I made the difficult decision to distance myself from Kevin. I couldn't keep putting myself in a position where I was expected to bail him out. It was taking a toll on my mental health, and I needed to prioritize my own well-being. I told my parents that I was stepping back and that they needed to stop enabling Kevin's behavior. They weren't happy about it, but I think they were starting to understand where I was coming from. They had spent so many years protecting Kevin from the consequences of his actions that they didn't know how to let go. But I knew that if they kept bailing him out, he'd never learn to stand on his own 2 feet. It wasn't easy. Cutting ties with my brother, even temporarily, was painful. But I knew it was the only way to break the cycle. I couldn't keep sacrificing my own happiness and financial stability to support someone who refused to take responsibility for his life. Months went by, and I focused on my own life. I threw myself into my work, spent time with friends, and tried to find peace with my decision. I didn't hear much from Kevin or my parents during that time, and part of me was relieved. But there was also a part of me that felt guilty. Guilty for not being there for my brother. Guilty for not being the good sibling. Then, out of the blue, I got a call from my dad. He sounded different, calmer, more resigned. He told me that Kevin had lost his job and that he was struggling to make ends meet. But instead of asking me to help, he simply said, "We've decided to sell the house." I was stunned. After all the drama, all the arguments, my parents had finally come to the conclusion that selling the house was the best option. They realized that Kevin wasn't capable of taking care of it, and that it was time to let go. A few weeks later, the house was sold. My parents used the money to buy a smaller place that was easier for them to manage, and Kevin was forced to find his own place to live. It wasn't easy for him. He struggled to find an affordable apartment and had to take on a second job to make ends meet. But it was a wake-up call that he desperately needed. Since the house was sold, things have changed. Kevin and I are still distant, but I've seen signs that he's starting to grow up. He's working hard, paying his own bills, and trying to figure out what he wants to do with his life. It's not a perfect situation, but it's progress. My parents, too, have started to let go of the guilt and responsibility they felt for Kevin. They've begun to see that enabling him was doing more harm than good, and they're focusing on their own happiness and well-being. As for me, I found a sense of peace that I didn't have before. It wasn't easy to stand up to my brother and my parents, but I knew it was the right thing to do. I've learned that sometimes the best way to help someone is to let them face the consequences of their actions. It's not easy, and it's not always pleasant, but it's necessary. So that's my story, Reddit. It's been a long and difficult journey, but I've finally reached a point where I feel like I'm in control of my life again. Family can be complicated, and sometimes the people we love the most are the ones who hurt us the most. But I've learned that it's okay to set boundaries, to say no, and to prioritize your own well-being. subscribe, and like for more videos.